Well, today is a very special Sunday. Some may even say that this Sunday is the second most important Sunday in Advent. Obviously, the most important Sunday in Advent is, the most important day in Advent is Christmas Day, and obviously that was on a Sunday this year. But this is the most important, I think, Sunday in Advent. And the reason being is because the Sunday after Christmas Day is known in the church calendar as Annual Youth Pastor Preaching Sunday. And I find myself thinking this is one of the most significant Sundays in Advent that there is. But in all seriousness, I think this is a significant Sunday. It's the last day of this year. And what's funny is that there's been two annual youth pastor preaching Sundays this year because the 1st of January was also on a Sunday. And so on the 1st of January, we actually had a message on the 1st of January, which we looked at entitled The Picture of the Promise. The Picture of the Promise. And it was all about this idea that God will give us a picture, or God will give us a promise. And as time goes on, that picture can turn into a reality. And so today, because this is the second National Youth Pastor Preaching Sunday of the year, I thought, why not make this a second part of a two-part series? The first part being on the 1st of January, and the last part being on the 31st of December. So the title today is The Fulfilment of the Promise. 1st of January was a picture of the promise. Today is the fulfillment of the promise. You know, very often when we get a promise from God, when we get a picture from God, a vision from God, a prophetic word from God, like there is in this passage. And in this passage, there is a prophetic picture in this from the book of Micah, which speaks about when the Messiah is going to be born and particularly focuses on where he's going to be born and what he's going to do as a result of being born there. But when we get a picture and a prophetic picture like this, very often there is a path towards the promise. There's a path that leads to the picture. And so the wise men here find themselves on a path towards this promise. They find themselves on a journey towards this promise. And for all of us, when we get a picture from God, a promise from God, there's always a journey that we have to go on. Often, the journey towards God's promises and the things that he's told us and the prophetic words that we've been given often take longer for us to get there than we would like them to. They often take longer. The journey's often bumpier. There's often misdirection at times. We get caught in all kinds of things. And that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at how do you make choices on the journey, on the path towards this picture of the promise that God's given you. How do you make choices to head towards fulfillment of that promise? And we see that these wise men, they make particular choices, which I think will help all of us step towards and journey towards the pictures and the promises that God has given us. So the first choice is choose to be active. Choose to be active. What I love about the wise men in particular is when they arrive, they start questioning. They're like, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? You know, they're active in their search. They're active in their pursuit. But they were also not just active when they kind of reached Bethlehem. They were active at the very beginning. Because in order to start on a journey, you have to start. You know, in order to take the last step, you first have to take the first step. And you've got to choose to be active. You've got to choose to go. And I remember when I was at the gym years ago, my gym at the time had this slogan on the wall, and it said, the hardest part of the journey is the start. And it was this idea that you've just got to get going. Actually, it's harder to just get going than it is to keep going, is what that was trying to say. And so for us and for you, if you've got a picture from God, if God's given you a promise, a vision, you've got to start. You've got to get going. That's the first step in being active, is to actually start. However, what I would say is, even though it can be hard to start, I would actually say the hardest journey to start is the one where you don't know the end. The hardest journey to start is the one where you don't know the end. And in particular, when you don't know where the end is. You know, these wise men, they saw a star and just followed the star. They had no idea how long they were going to be following this star for, or where, in fact, this star was going. But yet, they were still active in their pursuit. They still took active steps to following this star towards fulfillment of God's given promise to the world. And it can really be difficult for us when we step into in the unknown like that. I've learned a real lesson about my friend Dave in the last couple of years. And the lesson I've learned about Dave is never trust him when he's planning a bike ride. Because what I've learned about Dave when he takes us on a bike ride is that he tells us how long it's going to be and how far it's going to take, but he lies. Often the journey that we go on with Dave is harder than he says it's going to be, longer than he says it's going to take, and more difficult in every single way. And sometimes when we go on a journey towards God's promises, sometimes they can be like that. They can be longer than we want them to be, harder than we'd imagine that they were, and more difficult in every step of the way. But there's something so beautiful in being active and stepping towards it and keeping stepping towards it and keeping going, stepping towards it. And what I love about the wise men's story here is that as they continue to step and step and step towards where this star is taking them, there's this beautiful part towards the end when it says, they went on their way and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped. Until it stopped. You know, if there's one thing I would say to you about how do you, what's the mindset you need? What's the active mindset you need when you're stepping towards a promise from God and a picture from God? The thing I'd say to you is go until God says stop. Go until God says stop. And by the way, when we say go, that's not always a sense of running after it. It's not always a sense of trying to force it. Sometimes active means to wait, and to wait actively, to be prayerful in the process, to dig into things, to allow God to reveal things about yourself on the way, on the journey, to allow him to expose things and change things and heal things. You know, there's often lots of active steps that happen on the way to a fulfillment of God's promises. And some of them will be active steps of physically moving. But a lot of those steps will be steps of spiritually moving and emotionally moving. And so wherever you find yourself on your journeys towards the promises God has made you, I just want to encourage you to go until God says stop. To keep going, to keep praying, to keep pursuing, to keep pushing on those doors. Go until God says stop. Be active in our pursuit of the fulfillment of God's promises. So choose to be active. But secondly, choose to be informative. Choose to be informative. Very often, when we get a promise from God, even though God gives the promise, we still want the promise to look the way we want it to look. We often have our agenda, we often have our desires, our expectations, our assumptions. We often have our picture of a promise that sometimes is different to what God's is. Even though God speaks and he says things as how they're going to be, we often think, I want it to be this way. And often we try and make things happen to let our way happen instead of God's way. And what we do here is we choose to be impulsive over informative. We choose to be impulsive over informative. You know, in this passage, there is a number of people who actually act quite impulsively as opposed to informatively. And the first group is the wise men themselves. You see, the wise men themselves end up speaking to King Herod. But King Herod wasn't in Bethlehem. King Herod was in Jerusalem. In other words, they went to the wrong place. They still had a star telling them where to go and still ended up in the wrong place. You know, if you ever look on a map, Bethlehem is actually 10 kilometers away from Jerusalem. It's actually a significant distance away. It's a significant walk away, significant journey away. But yet, these wise men end up in Jerusalem in King Herod's palace. They end up where they weren't supposed to end. And the reason for that is because they acted impulsively. Their picture of a king was a king in a palace. Their picture of a king was probably not a baby, but a picture of someone who was fully grown. Their picture of a king was someone who ruled over people, and it was clear that they had power and authority from their position. And so they acted impulsively and went to King Herod as opposed to following the star. And in fact, when we read the text, you could also question, because they were so impulsive, did they lose the thing that made them informative? As in, did they lose the star? Because they go to Herod, and then it says after they were Herod, after they'd seen Herod, it says, as we've read earlier, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen, it's as if they were so impulsive that they lost sight of the thing that was guiding them towards the promise. And because they were impulsive and lost sight of it, the first king they went to was the wrong king. The wrong king. They ended up in the wrong place. And so for us, we need to allow things to be informative, not impulsive. Sometimes it's good to take time. I always say, make time your friend. You know, time, when we're heading towards a promise, we often see time as our enemy, because all we really want is the end thing in itself. We want to just get to the promise. God, you've said this, just let me get there. You know, I want to get there as quickly as I possibly can. But yet, if we make time our friend, there is things that happen on the way. There are opportunities to grow and learn, to get so much closer to Jesus, to dig in closer to Jesus. And in the process of making time our friend, the us that gets to the promise is often very different to the one that receives the promise. But yet, we want to be impulsive and just trying to get there now. But also, in being impulsive, it can not just take us off track, it can actually stop us moving in the first place. Because another group of people who are impulsive in this passage is the priests and the teachers of the law. When the wise men go to Herod, Herod gathers the priests and gathers the teachers of the law. And he says to them, what does the law say? What does the word say? And they literally say to him, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, and they explain about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. Now here's the thing. The people who said that were the priests and the teachers. The priests and the teachers who knew this and knew the words of the prophets and knew the promise better than anyone. No one would have known what the picture of the promise looked like better than these people. They would have studied the word. They'd have studied the prophets. They'd have not just had this prophetic word from Micah. They'd have known all of them. All the ones from Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Zechariah, all of them. They'd have known them all. But yet, out of their own impulse, despite the fact that they knew all this stuff and had the picture of the promise, they didn't go. They didn't go. They knew exactly where Jesus was going to be born, and yet they didn't even go because they were impulsive. But yet the wise men, you see, when they come to Herod and they hear this verse, for them it's extra information. It's extra informative. At first it's like, well, we've read the signs of the times, we've seen the star in the sky, and they followed it. But then on their journey, they get this extra bit of information that explains to them that what they're looking for is going to be born in Bethlehem. And so when we're heading towards a promise from God, when we're heading toward trying to get that fulfillment of the promise, be informative, not impulsive. Allow time to be your friend, because as you make time your friend, you get much more information along the way. And getting more information and godly wisdom and godly revelation along the way is going to lead you towards what that promise is, where it is. And so we've got to allow the Holy Spirit to inform us on the way and not put ourselves first and try and be impulsive and get ourselves there by ourselves. We need to let God do it. Be informative, not impulsive. So choose to be active, choose to be informative, and lastly, choose to give. Choose to give. You know, what is so special about these wise men is when they do get there to Jesus, when they see the fulfillment of the promise, when they see Jesus, when they see him there in that stable with Mary, you know, when they hear his crying, when they see the animals, when they get there, when they get that final picture, when they see the picture in reality, what's so beautiful is that their first action is to decide to give their treasures, but also to give themselves. You know, they give their treasure, but then they worship. And it's this real beautiful picture and posture of them giving themselves. And you know, one of the things I've reflected on this year is that, you know, when we enter into any covenant, whether it is following Jesus or it's marriage or whatever it is, any covenant is based on that principle of all that I am, I give to you, and everything I have, I share with you. And so what you see here is this beautiful picture of covenant. In their giving, you see a picture of covenant because they give all that they are and share all that they have with Jesus. And that is what a covenant relationship looks like. But this is what our God is like. Our God is a God of 100% because he gave all that he was to us and shared all that he had with us. That's why he's the ultimate fulfillment of the promise, because he promises himself. He promises to give himself. He promises us to be with us even to the ends of the age. But in order for us to receive and see the full fulfillment of what Jesus comes to bring, we've got to choose to give and give 100% of ourselves and give 100% of what we have. And so maybe for you, as we enter into a new year in a couple of hours, maybe this moment as we end one year and step into the next is actually a moment to almost renew your covenant with Jesus and to say, do you know what, Jesus, in 2024, I afresh want 2024 to be a year where I just give you all that I am and everything that I have. All that I am and everything that I have. And in doing so, we get to live out what the wise men lived out. We get to see Jesus. The best way to see Jesus in his fullness is to give him your fullness, is to give him everything that you've got. And in doing that, in making that choice, we'll head towards fulfillment of the promise. As we're active, as we're informative, as we give, along that process, we'll see God's fulfillment take place. We'll see the fulfillment of the promises God made us. And I just want to end with two stories, because 2023 for me has been a year of major promise fulfillment. And I just want to share these stories with you just from a point of, if you're in the middle of your promise, if you're in the middle of trying to get there and trying to see it be fulfilled, I just want to share these two stories with you, these two things this year where I've seen fulfillment in my life of promises that God made as a thing of encouragement to you to keep going, to go until God says stop. And so the first promise that I received was when I was 17. So that's 12 years ago now. And when I was 17, I remember going to a Christian festival, and I saw the person speaking on the stage at the time at this festival, and I really sensed God say to me, that's what you're going to do one day. Not just from a speaking point of view, but actually at a festival one day, that's what I'm calling you to do one day. And I can honestly say that I've spoken hundreds of times in hundreds of places, at all kinds of events, in college events, university events, church events. But it took until this year for me to actually do it at a festival. And so 12 years was kind of a long wait. But not only that, I remember that after receiving that promise, the first time I even spoke in a church was like 5 years after receiving the promise in the first place. And so, what I want to say in that is, with time being your friend, you understand that every season is a season of preparation. You understand that every step is a step of preparation towards the next step. And so in those 5 years between getting that original promise and speaking at church for the first time, I used to go and speak at lecturers' events. I actually did quite well in my degree when it came to presentations. And so I used to go and speak at lecturers' events. But it took years before getting to speak at a church, but yet the lecturers' events prepared me for church. And then speaking at church did begin, but it was very itty-bitty every so often. But then I used to started getting invited to youth church weekends. And I used to do a number of youth church weekends every year. I ended up doing more youth church weekends than speaking in church. But then I started speaking at church more, and then more. And so you can just see that there was layers upon layers of adding and adding and adding and adding, till eventually then speaking at a festival this year for the very first time. But it was a long process of 12 years to get there. But then the second promise I saw come to be fulfilled this year was getting married. And this was a promise to me because in 2017, I received a word from God that was prophetically given to me 3 times in different places about needing to wait 5 years in order to wait for someone before that was going to potentially happen. And so I remember really praying into this, really committing and praying. I remember a day where we as a family were on holiday in Canada at Niagara Falls. And at Niagara Falls, I saw, when the water comes down and the light hits it, just this picture of, rainbows in the sort of the mist of the water. And obviously a rainbow is a sign of God's promise. And so I was like, okay, I pursued that. But one of the things that in the process of this was it was held very, very lightly because of what it was about. But sometimes, as I've said, being active sometimes is about just waiting. And so for me, what I did in the process of this was, particularly as it got to a couple of years ago, I really had a real sense of God reaffirming this promise that he made. And so from that point, I decided to really actively go for things. And I used to fast and pray about it every month. And so every month I'd take 3 days to pray about this promise, to pray about my future, and just commit it to God. That was how active I wanted to be. I wanted to be like, hey, God, I want to give you 100%. So I'm going to fast and really pursue this as much as I can. And what was really funny in terms of how God was informative about this is because obviously at the time I had no idea I'd end up in London. That was never going to be something I would have expected in my life. Because I'd never visited London before, so let alone living in London and working in London, it just wasn't part of my thinking or agenda. But I remember as I was applying for jobs for last year, I applied for different jobs and I looked at loads of different churches in the London area. And I used to watch different talks from churches in the London area. I wanted to understand the demographic a bit more. I wanted to understand the area. And what's really funny is, so this is in 2021, a year before I moved to London, I actually watched a talk by Emma, who is now my wife. But a year before I even met her, I actually watched her talk by her. And so there's this real sense of, even though I didn't realize it, God was quite informative along the way. And then as a year went by, I then obviously moved here and then met her with no expectation, but then obviously kind of liked her. And then we did start dating, and then it did head towards marriage, and praise God that happened this year. But obviously from 2017, seeing the rainbows in the sky, look at it, could be like a star in the sky, whatever you want to call it, from seeing that covenant, from seeing that promise, it was 5 years before I actually did meet Emma. But in the process, I could show you all my journals in those 5 years. And if I showed you all those journals in those 5 years, they were filled with a lot of stuff. But what they were ultimately filled with was a lot of digging. A lot of digging into Jesus, a lot of trying to get closer to Jesus, a lot of counseling, a lot of prayerful ministry times, a lot of tears, a lot of pain, a lot of just having to look to God in a different way in order to, make me into the man that I needed to be at the end of the process of the promise. But then God was faithful in it as he changed me, as he molded me. For both of those promises that have been fulfilled this year, a 12-year wait, a 5-year wait, what I just want to encourage you with is, because I've been in the middle of these for years, and I know how hard it is to be in the middle of them. I know how messy it is to be in the middle of them. But what I know at the end of them is that he who called is faithful. Like he is faithful. And so I just want to encourage you to, even in the midst and the middle of, even if it's messy, and even if you're doubting, and even if you're struggling, that word God gave you, I just want to encourage you to choose to be active. Keep praying, keep pushing the doors, keep knocking, keep being obedient, keep following the stars that he shows you. Choose to be informative. Don't rush it. Don't be impulsive. Don't try and get there by yourself. Be informative. Make time your friend. Let God speak to you along the way. Let the star keep appearing. Let God keep speaking to you. Let his word, like it was for the wise men, let his word be a shining light to you on where you should go and what you should do. And choose to give. Continue to give 100% of yourself. Continue to give all that you are and all that you have to Jesus.